May I stand unshaken amidst the crash of words. May I stand unshaken amidst the crash of words.
Going into Red Dead Redemption 2, many of us already had an expectation on how the story would go, and for the most part, what we expect is what happens. Arthur Morgan dies, Dutch van der Linde goes crazy, and John Marston starts his new life in Beecher's Hope with Abigail and Jack, and also Uncle. The thing is though, while many of us had an idea on how the story would conclude, we really didn't know what exactly would lead to Arthur Morgan's death. What would cause Dutch to go crazy? What would be the fate of the numerous other gang members? And how would John Marston and his family leave the gang life behind? These are the questions I personally had entering into Red Dead Redemption 2, and I have to say what Rockstar Games delivered on the story was something truly unique, something that I did not think was possible. This emotional journey with Arthur Morgan is arguably the best gaming has to offer, and that's thanks to a well-crafted world, phenomenal writing, a musical score that brings so much more power to key moments, and some of the best voice acting I've ever personally seen. But let's go to the beginning, because it's important to understand how Dutch van der Linde's gang changes over time and what ultimately causes things to fall apart. The story opens up with the gang defeated after a failed robbery in the town of Blackwater, which leaves multiple gang members dead, which includes Jenny Kirk and Davy Callender. The gang heads north into the snowy mountains of Amberino to escape the authorities that were chasing them, and this first chapter is really about survival. Dutch at the start seems caring and genuinely wants to take care of his people, but as we go through these chapters, it appears more that Dutch really cares about himself. He's very egotistical and narcissistic. In these first chapters, we do get an understanding of who Arthur Morgan is as the protagonist and many of the other gang members, but Arthur comes off at the start as someone who is a ruthless outlaw, who will do what it takes to accomplish his task. He's also extremely loyal to Dutch and his mission, which is one reason why he is not very fond of John Marston at the beginning, as he apparently had left the gang and his family for about a year, and why he takes some convincing by Abigail to go and rescue John with Javier. Now, other than Arthur, as I mentioned before, we get to know some of the other gang members. Sadie is a tough woman who has just lost her husband and is seeking revenge. Hosea is Dutch's best friend and right-hand man. Bill is, well, he's dumb. Charles is a fairly new recruit but a great hunter, and Micah is fairly new as well and a bit of a lunatic and a jerk. Now, once the gang is a bit on their feet, they attack a nearby camp of O'Driscolls, which is also where Kieran is captured, and we get an understanding that Colm O'Driscoll is Dutch's rival. But after the successful attack, the gang finds plans for a train robbery which has valuable bonds that belong to a robber baron-like character, Leviticus Cornwall. But this robbery allows the gang to find their footing and finally make a move to just outside of the town of Valentine, and for a while things are pretty good for the gang. Arthur goes drinking with Lenny, hunting with Hosea, brings Karen and some of the other girls into town with Uncle, saves Sean from bounty hunters, takes part in another train robbery with John, Sean, and Charles. Arthur saves Reverend Swanson multiple times as he's drunk and being dumb, and he does some debt collections for Leopold Strauss, which unfortunately an encounter that Arthur has with Thomas Downs, someone in debt to the gang, is how he gets tuberculosis, as Downs, who is noticeably sick, accidentally or purposely spits his blood on Arthur as he beats Downs for not having the money he owes. This disease does not have an immediate effect on Arthur, but it does change who he is later on. Now, besides these missions involving other gang members, Arthur does reconnect with his past love, Mary Linton, in which Arthur helps save her brother Jamie from some weird religious cult. This mission is one of the few times we hear about Arthur's life outside of the gang, and it really shows just how loyal to the gang he is and how he sees them all as his family, people that he can't and will not leave. But yeah, for a while things are good until it's revealed that the Pinkerton agents have been hired by Leviticus Cornwall, and through a few encounters with agents Milton and Ross, as well as other unnamed agents, this forces the gang to relocate south. This is where Dutch makes a plan to try and turn the town's rival plantation families against each other, but the issue is that Dutch wants to try and rob them both. I think this is really where Arthur starts starts to question Dutch's decision making. Earlier in the story, John made his doubts known to Arthur, but at least at that time, I don't think Arthur was doubting Dutch at all. And even in chapter 3, I don't believe Arthur was fully sure what to think. He certainly did not sound like he liked the plan, but he trusted Dutch would make the best decision for the gang. Ultimately, though, the plan fails as the families figure out what's happening, leading to the Greys killing Sean and the Braithwaites kidnapping Jack Marston and giving him to Angelo Bronte, who pretty much runs the city of Saint Denis. After the gang gets payback on the families, I think this is really where things just get worse and worse. The gang relocates to Shady Belle and head for Saint Denis, in which they meet Angelo Bronte. Bronte has the gang do a minor favor for him and gives Jack back, but through these encounters he continually mocks Dutch and the gang. He also clearly wants to use the gang to take out people he dislikes, but when Dutch pushes back at that idea, he certainly sounds annoyed and continues to mock the cowboys, as he says. He also lies to them about a hot spot for money and sets them up, leading to Dutch seeking revenge, something that he previously in the story called a fool's game. After the gang captures Bronte, this is really where Arthur and John notice things have changed for the worse. It appears that the plan is to ransom Bronte, but after Bronte says Dutch is pathetic and nothing, and that he called for the Pinkertons, he snaps and kills Bronte. This is the moment where I really believe Arthur and John see that Dutch has changed and has lost his way. They both show a face of horror, shock, and disbelief. John confronts Dutch about this dumb decision, and he tries to spin it as being something that needed to be done. Around this time, also Kieran, who is now a gang member, is killed by his former gang, the O'Driscolls, who put his headless body on a horse and send it into Shady Belle before ambushing the gang's camp. This is also where we get to see just how much hatred Sadie Adler has for the O'Driscolls, as she brutally takes out multiple attackers. But anyway, this all leads to the Saint Denis robbery, which, like many of Dutch's plans, also goes south, as the Pinkertons clearly knew ahead of time that this was going to go down. They capture Hosea Matthews and send a message to the gang by killing him in front of them. And in the gang's escape, Lenny also dies and John is captured. Thanks to a distraction done by Charles, Arthur, Dutch, Javier, Micah, and Belle jump on a ship to escape the city as the Pinkertons had it on lockdown looking for them. Now this is the Guarma chapter, which I've heard some people say was something that was not needed, but I actually beg to differ. After the ship wrecks and Arthur meets up with the rest of the gang on the island, which is close to Cuba, we finally see that Dutch's dream is a fairy tale. He spoke at lengths about taking a boat to Tahiti, and the problem with leaving one country is no matter where you go, there will be problems. There is not a way to escape. And Guarma shows this paradise of an island embroiled in a war which we have to make our way through. Interestingly, Dutch through this chapter has bright and sour moments, like he accurately predicts that someone in the gang has been spying for the Pinkertons. But also we see him murder an old woman who is helping him. He murders her because he promised her more gold than he had, and he then proceeds to lie to Arthur about why he did it. After helping fight against the Cuban army, we then head back to find the rest of the gang who is hiding out in Lakay. Because of probably Bill Williamson, the Pinkertons discover the hideout and attack, but thanks to Arthur using the Maxim gun, the gang successfully defends the camp. Although soon after we find out that Arthur's cough is something much more serious as he passes out and is brought to a doctor who diagnoses him with tuberculosis, which at the time was a death sentence. This is when we know Arthur Morgan will not finish the story alive, and something he slowly comes to terms with. But after this diagnosis, Arthur really just keeps quiet about his life being close to over. He proceeds to help figure out a way to break John Marston out of jail, even though Dutch does not want to do that, as it's not a part of his plan. The gang then again relocates to Beaver Hollow, but this is when Arthur disobeys Dutch's order and he goes with Sadie to break John out. When riding back to camp, John and Arthur discuss Dutch and how he has changed, and John reveals that Dutch could have prevented him from being arrested in Saint Denis, but he did not bother to try and save John. Now once back at camp, the reception is not what you might expect, as Dutch is angered that Arthur did this breakout without his approval, and when John mentions that they were thinking about hanging him, Dutch does not really seem to care. This chapter 6 really just shows the fall of Dutch and the gang. You'll also notice with Hosea no longer around, Dutch looks to the reckless Micah Bell to take that role, as Arthur Arthur continues to doubt everything Dutch does, as it typically leads to failure and deaths. Molly, who is kind of Dutch's lover, gets drunk and claims to have told the Pinkertons ahead of time about the Saint Denis robbery, which leads to Miss Grimshaw killing her for being a traitor, although later on it's revealed that she was not a traitor but just looking for Dutch's attention, as he typically ignored her. Dutch then confronts Leviticus Cornwall in Annesburg and murders him, which is something that shocks Arthur, as again it's another instance of Dutch seeking revenge and something that Micah stands by, pretty much stroking his ego and encouraging these poor decisions. But after this we find out Dutch's big new plan, which is to try and turn the Native Americans against the US Army, which he believes a distraction like this could help the gang take advantage and slip away. Soon after, one of the bright missions of this chapter has Arthur, Sadie, and Dutch ensuring Colm O'Driscoll's hanging in Saint Denis goes through, which the expression on Colm's face when he realizes he's going to die it's priceless. But at this point in the story, Arthur is getting more and more sick, and the remaining members of the gang are split on how they feel about Dutch's plan. Arthur and John talk about Dutch's decline, and Arthur tells John to prepare his family to leave. And throughout this chapter, characters like Pearson, Mary Beth, Josiah Trelawney, and Reverend Swanson leave the gang. Now, there's a really defining moment that happens if you complete the Brother Dorkins and Sister Calderon side quest through the story. After the negotiations between the native leader Rainsfall and the US Army Colonel Favors go bad, Arthur brings Captain Monroe to the train station where he meets Sister Calderon, who's about to leave. And this is one of the moments that you really see Arthur open up.
What's wrong?
I'm dying, sister.
Okay.
Yeah, I got TB. I got it. Beating a man to death for a few bucks. I've lived a bad life, sister.
We've all lived bad lives, Mr. Morgan. We all sin. But I know you.
You don't know me.
Forgive me, but that's the problem. You don't know you.
What do you mean?
I don't know, but whenever we happen to meet, you're always helping people and smiling.
I had a son. He passed away. I had a girl who loved me. I threw that away. My mama died when I was a kid. And my daddy, well, I watched him die. And it weren't soon enough.
My husband died a long time ago. Life is full of pain. But there is also love and beauty.
What am I gonna do now?
Be grateful that for the first time, you see your life clearly.
Sure.
Perhaps you could help somebody. Helping makes you really happy.
But I still don't believe in nothing.
Often, neither do I.
Huh?
But then I meet someone like you, and everything makes sense.
You're too smart for me, sister. I guess I'm afraid.
There is nothing to be afraid of, Mr. Morgan. Take a gamble that love exists and do a loving act.
All aboard!
That "I'm afraid" may be just 2 words, but it killed me when Arthur says it because you can hear the fear in his voice. Arthur finally tells us that he regrets many of the decisions he's made in his life. He mentions his own son Isaac, who died, that he didn't really get to know, and he mentions the love between himself and Mary Linton that he wishes he had not let die. But ultimately this leads to his redemption arc of trying to help John and his family get away from this mess. Now we later fight alongside the natives as they attack the oil factory, which again Dutch uses to his advantage to steal state bonds, but after that, Arthur is nearly stabbed to death by a US soldier, and this time Dutch just watches and walks away, but thanks to Eagle Flies, he saves Arthur's life before being shot by Colonel Favors, who Arthur kills soon after. We then take part in one more train robbery, which again Dutch this time leaves John behind after he's shot and claims there was nothing he could do and that he died. This decision by Dutch not to care about John's well-being goes back to his ego, and being that John has been vocally against Dutch's plans, he decides not to help John, something that he also chose to do with Arthur. This all goes back to Dutch's "you're either with me or against me" belief. Here at the end of the gang story, Dutch just wants those who follow him to fall in line, and if you don't do that, he clearly is willing to let those who oppose his views in the gang die. Now to the final mission, this is where it's revealed by Tilly that Abigail has been kidnapped by the Pinkertons, and Dutch and Micah both refuse to help as they now have the necessary money to leave. Arthur is disgusted and saddened by Dutch not doing anything, but this is when Arthur says goodbye to Tilly and Jack, handing Tilly tons of money and telling her to wait at Copperhead Landing for Abigail and Sadie. These final interactions that Arthur has with these characters are devastating, because you know the end is near, and I'll be honest, just hearing Arthur tell Tilly to live a happy life, it hit me emotionally. But continuing forward, Arthur and Sadie move out together and then save Abigail from Agent Milton, who is holding her in the town of Van Horn. Before he's killed by Abigail, he reveals that Micah was actually the spy, or well, the rat. This leads to Arthur, Abigail, and Sadie having another emotional goodbye, and Arthur next heads back to camp to confront Micah, and when he arrives, sides are taken. John then returns and reveals that Dutch left him behind. Grimshaw stands by Arthur and is then killed by Micah, and then Dutch takes Micah's side before the Pinkertons, led by Agent Ross, ambush the camp. Now the actual ending does vary depending on choice, but I helped John escape, leading to Arthur and Micah fighting it out, and ultimately Dutch stopping Arthur from killing Micah, leaving him there in sadness for what Dutch has become. But Dutch does not follow Micah, he simply walks away in a different direction, and then finally Arthur moves up to see the sunrise before he finally passes away. That is the story of Red Dead Redemption 2. Before we get to the epilogue, I think we should talk a little bit about this ending. I noticed some people did not like that tuberculosis took his life, but I felt it was so much more emotional knowing Arthur was slowly dying. And like Charles said before to Arthur, at least he has a chance to say goodbye, while others like Hosea and Lenny weren't as lucky to get that. But yeah, the real antagonist of this game is not Leviticus Cornwall, Angelo Bronte, Como Driscoll, Agent Milton, or even Dutch Vanderlyn, it's Micah Bell. Without Hosea, Dutch let Micah become his new right-hand man, which made his decisions more and more reckless. Micah served as a yes man, but that's not what Dutch needed. Having Arthur and Hosea by his side earlier on at least had him open to logical decisions, but unfortunately with Hosea gone and Arthur and Dutch at odds, Micah took advantage. Dutch in Chapter 6 also began changing his plans from wanting to go to Tahiti after one more score, and then he wanted to go to New York and create some chaos first. Dutch went insane and lost hold of his vision that already was flawed. With him slowly going insane, he also let a relatively new member convince him that the gang members that were like sons to him were against him. As Arthur even puts it, it's hard to say if Dutch really went insane and changed or if he was always truly like that. But the last wish from Arthur Morgan to John Marston was for him to leave this gang life behind. Which, let's get into the epilogue. It's now about 8 years later, the year is 1907, and this is what I would consider the fan service part of the game. We see John Marston try and live the life of a rancher for a Mr. Gades, but because of a nearby gang, he's forced to become the gunslinger he used to be. Abigail and Jack leave for a period of time as Abigail did not like John becoming his old self again, but because John helped the ranch he was working at by taking care of the nearby gang, they repay him by helping him secure a loan. This is where John meets up with Uncle and later Charles, and they build Beecher's Hope, although Uncle tries getting out of helping, citing his very serious diagnosis of lumbago. Yeah. Later we take part in a few bounty hunting missions with Sadie, and then John writes to Abigail and Jack to come to their new home. We see the Abigail and John romance for a little bit, which leads to a proposal with the ring that Arthur had originally given to Mary Linton. I will add the relationship of John and Abigail is much different than Red Dead Redemption 1's, where they seem sick of each other and you don't really see the love that they have for each other at all. So it definitely was nice to see that in Red Dead Redemption 2 in 1899 1909 and 1907, but I do think there was some creative changes made with Abigail's character, probably for the better good. But this whole entire epilogue finally leads to a revenge mission to go and kill Micah Bell. Abigail tries to get John from doing this, but he does not listen, and John, Charles, Sadie move out to go and get revenge. Sadie and Charles do get hurt, leaving John to be the one responsible for taking Micah and his associates out. This leads to a final confrontation in which Sadie actually shows up and she tries sneaking up on Micah, but ends up failing when Dutch reveals himself. It appears that at least for some time he returned to working with Micah, but after John tries to speak some sense to Dutch, he ultimately just decides to turn the gun on Micah, in which John finishes him off, and Dutch just walks away with a little bit of anger on his face, leaving behind a fortune from the Blackwater robbery for Charles, John, and Sadie to take. Now in the final credits, shortly after Micah's death, Edgar Ross and Archer Fordham of the newly formed Bureau of Investigations, or the BOI, investigate his death, in which later they discover that John Marston was behind it, which you have to wonder, if John does not seek revenge, do the government agents force him to hunt down the other gang members in Red Dead Redemption? Either way, this goes into the whole revenge thing Arthur and for a period Dutch mentioned. It's a fool's game, and this in my opinion makes the events in 1911 even more tragic, knowing that Arthur would have wanted John just to move on, but because he did not listen, years later he would lose his life. Besides that, we do see Abigail and John officially get married. Charles soon after leaves. He previously discussed heading north to settle down in Canada. Sadie also soon after leaves, and she previously mentioned going south to continue her work. We also find out in a previous conversation that Leopold Strauss was captured by the Pinkerton Detective Agency and interrogated, which he actually didn't say a word about the gang and would not reveal anything, which is likely why he died in custody. Reverend Swanson ended up moving to New York to become a preacher, and in Blackwater Ledger number 74 newspaper, it reveals that Swanson became the minister of the First Congregational Church of New York. We also find out that Pearson is now the owner of the general store in Rhodes. He still actually keeps a picture of the gang in his store, remembering the old times. Mary Beth is now a romantic novelist that John can meet at the train station in Valentine. She uses Leslie DuPont as her pen name. Tilly Jackson is now Tilly Pierre, as she later becomes married to a lawyer and has a child. If John meets her in Saint Denis, she'll briefly talk to him and later write a letter to him. Rains Fall, who appears in I believe the last scene overlooking the vast world of Red Dead Redemption 2, looking at an eagle fly above, remembering his son, can be met in Annesburg, in which he reveals that his tribe is just really a few families now, and they reside in Canada. He does also ask about Arthur Morgan, in which John reveals that he passed long ago. But finally, Mary Lytton visits and cries over the graveside of Arthur Morgan, which tells me that she never stopped loving Arthur and deep down wishes that they had ran off together. So my overall experience with this story brought me so many smiles and tears. After Arthur passes away, it felt different playing as John Marston, and the truth is, I did not want to experience more of this game without Arthur being the protagonist. Arthur was voice acted by Roger Clark, and I just have to say he nailed the character, and I do think this is arguably the best protagonist I've ever played as. Rockstar Games certainly delivered their best writing with this game, but the one aspect I wish had been explored more is Mary and Arthur's relationship. I was a little disappointed that that romance was left to a letter, which also did not quite make 100% sense, which makes me wonder if there was more encounters recorded but ultimately scrapped at the last minute. Anyway, as I mentioned a bit ago, we do see that Mary never stops loving Arthur, and the sad thing is, Arthur at the end clearly wished he had made different decisions when he was younger. Now, one thing that I have not mentioned that I was happy to see is that Arthur at least tries to make up his mistakes with Miss Downs, who after her husband's death from tuberculosis was forced to become a working girl, and if Arthur helps her out, she does not forgive him, and Arthur does not want that, but he just wants to help. And later in Blackwater Ledger number 75, the newspaper, it's revealed that Miss Downs and her son by 1907 have opened a brand new golf course and own several successful businesses out west, which may be thanks to Arthur Morgan's help. It just is interesting because at the beginning Arthur can be very cold and ruthless, which is how he was towards Thomas Downs, but by the end he is just sad for the life he lived. He's sad for the mistakes that he's made, and helping people before he passed was something that was encouraged by Sister Calderon, and that last heartbreaking encounter at the train station. I know a lot of people have wondered what was the significance of either the deer or wolf dreamlike sequences that would pop up time and time again throughout the story. Well, this is actually based on honor. If you played more honorable, you will see the deer, and if not, you see the wolf. Each animal represents your play style, and it's actually said that these spiritual animals, if seen in dreams, hold a meaning to who you are. So the wolf is said to be more aggressive and less caring about others than itself, and some people even describe seeing the animal as being evil, while the deer is the opposite, as seeing the animal means to be more gentle, compassionate, and being the one to make the ultimate sacrifice, which makes complete sense to whichever way you played as Arthur Morgan. But pretty much honor plays a bigger role than you might expect in the story, like the ending can involve Micah shooting Arthur in the head depending on how you play, and if you played less honorable, Arthur's grave will not have any flowers left in front. But in conclusion, the vision that Dutch had that all of the gang believed in was never realistic or possible, but for a long time the gang was a family, and you really felt that when there was celebrations or parties for Sean's return or Jack's return. I think moments like that really made me care for these people, and I'm genuinely happy that not everyone ends up dying, and many of the gang moves on to live normal lives later on. But I do wonder if Dutch was ever able to put his ego to the side for a minute and listen to what John or Arthur was saying. Could things have gone differently? But Arthur's final mission in his life was a success, but I just cannot stop pondering the words Arthur preaches to John, and the fact that if John truly takes that advice, do the events that take place a few years later in 1911 even happen? But I can only hope that Red Dead Redemption 2 has a lasting impact on this gaming industry. The storytelling of this game did not force emotion but created it by developing these characters and making you genuinely care for what would happen to them. I've never felt so invested into a game's story ever, and I've never felt so devastated, but I'm sure as hell glad I was able to experience the story of Arthur Morgan. Thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts on the story of Red Dead Redemption 2 in the comment section below, and remember, outlaws to the end.